What is that? That's like delayed like 2 days.
What is that from?
Uh-oh.
This is Shamal Tirmidhi, day 2.
Yeah, but did you click the red link or
The red link.
the red link should be good.
Let me try now. Yeah, this is from Shamal day 2.
Well, it's taking me to the right one. Let me try it again.
Nazir, can you bring me some tea, Nazir?
That's in like 5 minutes.
Can we get started on it?
Yeah. Check it now.
Okay, please check it out. It's still going to Shamal day 2.
Okay.
Alright, we'll figure that out inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. We begin with the praise of Allah. We ask Him to teach Allah to send His peace and blessings upon His final messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family, his companions, and all those who follow his way until the day of judgment. So alhamdulillah, we'll be beginning with day 2 of our intensive. We have a lot of hadith to cover inshallah, so without further ado, we will pass it on to Imam Yusuf Rios inshallah. We will be covering, we have already covered the first 2 hadith of Imam Nawawi, 40 hadith, and we will be continuing accordingly.
Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. And so we continue inshallah with the 40 hadith of Imam al-Nawawi rahmatullahi alayhi. There's a few things that I wanted you guys to put in your notes with regard to ta'liqat, or just a very brief statement for each hadith so far that we've covered. As far as the hadith of intention, Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi, which the hadith of intention is the first hadith which introduces the collection of the 40 hadith. So Imam Shafi rahmatullahi alayhi, one of the things that he says with regard to this hadith of intention is that this hadith covers 77 areas of knowledge or sections of knowledge. That's to show that it's widespread. Before him, Imam Ibn Mahdi, he said 33 areas of knowledge. But he said that the hadith itself, it should initiate a book that is compiled in knowledge. In other words, so that each book that is compiled in knowledge should remind us with regard to the intention and the purpose and the goal. Also, the hadith itself is considered from the qawaid fiqhiyya, or the legal maxims, like the maxim that states al-umur bi maqasidiha, or affairs are determined by their objectives. Affairs are determined by their objectives. And so that hadith, is something that also teaches us not only that we ourselves should have objectives, but that the Sharia itself has objectives and goals. And that's, that understanding that the Sharia has objectives and goals, it was lost to us for quite a long time, right? And mostly everybody looks at the da'wah and the Sharia in an atomistic way. It's not in a holistic way. Like you find some people when they do da'wah, everything focus on aqidah, 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 aqidah. and they don't look at the deen as a whole, right? Or some people focus on tazkiyat an-nafs, and we mentioned this before. They don't look at the deen as a whole. But the hadith itself teaches us, when we look at it from the angle of what the scholars of usul and fiqh say, scholars of the principles of the sharia, and the scholars that look at how it is that the sharia applies to life, the scholars of fiqh in that regard. If we take fiqh in its very narrow sense, it means the knowledge of the halal and the haram. It means that knowledge which guides us in what we're doing in the daily life. We can't say that anything is halal or haram. We have to say that action is halal and haram. It's different than saying this thing is halal or haram. Because a thing doesn't come to account before Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So when we say that something is halal and haram, we're talking about our actions, because we're talking either about reward or punishment for what we do. And so the knowledge of fiqh pertains to understanding that which is halal or haram. The knowledge of aqeedah pertains to that which relates to what we believe regarding Allah and some other factors in the deen. Tawheed focuses on the oneness of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, whereas Iman encompasses Tawheed. The knowledge of Tawheed talks about who Allah is, characteristics of Allah, what are the rights of Allah as far as worship. But Iman is much more expansive than that. Iman covers other things outside of the issue of Tawheed or what we believe. You'll find that Iman can cover aspects of the deen, such as what? Good manners, such as what? Giving or showing concern for your neighbor. So the hadith itself of intention, it pertains to what's going on in our hearts, but also it teaches us that the deen itself has objective actions. Our actions should have an objective. But how do we know what objective is suitable for our well-being and what objective is not suitable for our well-being? It's the sharia, it's the deen which gives us that sense of direction. You see the difference? That the hadith of intention is pointing out to us two things. It points out to us that we should be people of organization and objectives in life. And that's, we find that in the corporate world. That's something that's very clear. No corporation is going to spend $1 million or $1 billion on a project if you don't give what are the objectives and how it's going to be achieved, right? Right? So that's the reality. And this culture creates a sense of what? Meaninglessness. Part of that has to do with making profit. If you don't have any direction in your life, we'll market to you what will make you happy, what's pleasurable, what's fun, what gives you meaning, what gives you purpose. You have old age comes to you, you start to lose your hair, we'll market to you that will bring you hair. You don't feel good about your body, we'll market to you beautiful skin, and we'll market to you, the sexy body, so to speak, whatever it is to make you feel like you're something or someone of value, that we can get money from you. But that meaninglessness is not in the deen. Right? This is an aspect of kufr, that life doesn't have meaning. That's not the way we think about life. That benefits the marketplace. But I want to review this point really, so that it's clear in our minds. That the hadith of intention is one of those hadith which is supreme. And like we see that Imam ibn Mahdi, he mentioned that anybody that compiles a book of knowledge should initiate that book with the hadith of intention, so that we have a sense of purpose and what direction it is. But the ulama of fiqh and usul, they look at this hadith as the basis of what? Of the principle in the sharia. There's a principle in the sharia that says al-umuru bi maqasidiha, that affairs are determined by their aims and objectives. So the sharia itself has objectives. Like the sharia itself Part of the whole reason for his legislation is so that we know who Allah is. Tawheed. One of the others is so that we come to understand the importance of the sanctity of human life. One hadith will come in the 40 hadith which will talk about the sanctity of human life. Because without life, sending the Rusul doesn't mean anything. If there's no human being, there's no purpose to send the Rusul. So the Sharia itself is designed. One of the objectives that it aims at is preserving human life. But not just that, a life without intellect for the human being, it doesn't make any sense. Because in the Sharia, the knowledge of the halal and the haram won't apply if you don't understand it. So your intellect has to be preserved. That's why the Sharia it forbids or prohibits the killing of life indiscriminately. It forbids intoxicants, drugs and all of these things. Right? In the first case, why does it forbid the killing of life indiscriminately? Because that's only the issue of life and death is the right of Allah Ta'ala. We can't just take human beings off of the face of the earth because we feel like it. And before that, prohibit shirk. Because without a correct understanding of who Allah is, we won't understand ourselves, the meaning of life, how it is that we will conduct ourselves. The whole of the deen is rooted in Tawheed in essence. Are we clear on that point? So then what the major objectives is that of preserving who Allah is, Tawheed. And the deen, everything that revolves around the deen. Because it's not just the issue of a set of beliefs that we have in mind, but it's also a set of actions. And it's not just that, like for instance in the hadith that we read in the hadith of Jibreel, it limits Islam to the arkan. And then everything else seems like it's for free for all, but it's not. There's other points of legislation which teach us that, the deen applies to what? The deen applies to the rest of life, to marriage, to economics, to politics, everything, the rest of life. How we deal with animals. This is one of the important points of dabiha. Because the issue of dabiha is not just bismillah, mashallah, and you just slaughter the animal, right? It's like the animal has rights to be treated properly. And life can't be taken away except with the permission of Allah. So when we take that life away, we have to have permission from Allah Ta'ala. It's not just a ritual of, oh mashallah, we mentioned the dabiha, we mentioned the bismillah over it and we make the dabiha. It's not just a ritual. The animal has rights, the environment has rights. So that's why we say, at least in the Chicagoland area, there's clarity on that. Dabiha halal. There's clarity on that point. That animal is raised properly in the proper environment, it's sustainable, and so on and so forth. So that hadith of intention, it teaches us that not only should we have the right intention in our heart, but what is it that our heart aims at? Well, the deen has objectives. Preservation of the deen, preservation of human life, preservation of intellect, preservation of family. This is why marriage is important. This is the issue of why marriage is important. Because of the preservation of family. This is why Islam forbids zina or forbids boyfriend and girlfriends, because that doesn't it doesn't bring the marital life together. There's no marital life in that. There's no contract, there's no rights, there's no dignity. And the issue of wealth. The deen preserves wealth. This is why the deen prohibits riba. Because the riba destroys wealth. And also contracts which are fraudulent, contracts which are oppressive. Because this destroys the economic relationship between people. And then the deen also, some of the ulama, in which I fall in that line with them, preserves human dignity. Because what is all that life? The life of iman, the life of, we preserve life, and, the life that we preserve intellect, and that we preserve family life, and we preserve wealth, if there's no dignity. If the human being is humiliated, has no value. Right? And so those things. And then the Quran itself says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. If we were to collapse maybe the sixth objective into the preservation of life, and we say, yeah, we preserve life, but life also with dignity, not just, we have some of our people on the face of the earth, they go to factory work for pennies, slave, like almost 20 hours. Then we go to Target, or we go to Kohl's or wherever it is, and we buy a shirt for like $70. They made it for pennies, and then they go home and they barely can eat. That's not a dignified life. Right? And so That this hadith, it goes into multiple areas. And we mentioned that the hadith of intention, the hadith of Jibreel, is the mother of the sunnah. It's the core. All of the sunnah will come back to it some way or another. Talk about the issue of halal haram, talk about the issue of tawheed, talk about the issue of tazkiyat an-nafs. It will, all of the rulings in the deen will come back to talk about who Allah is, issues of what we believe in Allah, or issues of right or wrong, or issues of the quality of our hearts, what's going on in the heart, the spiritual life. Spiritual life is like, in the superheroes realm, that's where you have these, it's like in the world where there's spiritual powers. Right? It's not as exaggerated as the superhero realm, right? But there's another dimension, in other words. The dimension of the unseen. And it's true that powers come with people of taqwa, people that obey Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. May Allah make us from those people. Those people that obey Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala and they keep themselves from major sin and they protect themselves from minor sin, they get insight in the dunya. And we have a teaching of that in the deen, the farasa, or the insight of the believer, where you're able to read people. And also, even though it's not essential in the deen, but sometimes even Allah gives you premonition. It's not something that we necessarily aim for in Islam, but as a consequence of good practice, and Allah shields us. Right? Allah shields us. There's like a shield that comes. Even the issue, there's a big difference between the people of taqwa and the people that are not securing themselves in following Allah. The people of taqwa is like, for instance, it's like, for instance, if you're used to eating great food, or like some of the older people say, tasty food. If you eat tasty food or good food. If you eat bad food or you eat that gasoline station food, what happens? Huh? Aside from getting sick, immediately on your tongue. If you're used to eating tres leches from your home, and then you go and you eat some nasty, cake from the gas station that's been sitting around for like 6 months and probably has an expired date, but you're hungry and you just open it up. Immediately, it's an exaggeration, but your mouth automatically is like, ew, like you taste the chemicals and everything. That's the same thing with the issue of sin. When you live a life of purity, you just know from a distance, it just smells foul. It's foul. Your nature is not inclined to that. That's why we always say to the youth, safeguard yourself. If you make yourself accustomed to the sins, then it's easy for you to sin. If you have defended yourself from that type of lifestyle, something that you can't even imagine, it's not even within your realm of thinking about. It's something that you're not even inclined to, period. The danger in this culture sometimes, there's benefits, but the danger in this culture is that sometimes it exposes us to certain things which kills our defenses. Right? There's good in it too. There's good in the culture. It's not just all evil. Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayh, he classifies societies like according to the nafs. There's a nafs al-ammara bisu, right? And this is like a Quranic concept. That there's that self or that soul which is constantly commanding to evil. It's like evil soul, right? And this is one of the dangers of some of these cartoons, some of the video games sometimes, that some of the things that are done on the video, I go chop the head off of this particular feature, I go shoot up this particular thing, you know what I'm saying? It gets the person in the habit of what? Not only violence, but and what about if somebody has some if somebody has some tragedy and some of the cartoons and the cartoon is sitting on the side, that's how, that's the type of mentality that people develop. They see people hurt, or they see people in pain and suffering, and it becomes like they become stupefied, and they become inclined to that, right? And so that's the issue, that that keeping the self pure in that regard, is also about training what we expose our hearts to. That's not easy, because we also don't want to go to the other extreme. What's the other extreme? no fun. Everything is just what? Yeah, the haram police mentality. In that, you have to have balance. It's not all the way to the exaggeration to that end of everything is loose and there's no boundary. It's not to this end over here where everything is just haram and we only function like this. The deen is not like that. You'll get sick. You won't be able to function. And when you get married, you won't last. You have to have balance. Women teach us the balance a lot of times. Men sometimes they bring the discipline. Women sometimes they teach us the balance. You have kids, you have to deal with them. Right? Deal with the kids doesn't, it means you play with them. The Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he emphasized also the what? Compassion and affection for the kids, for the children. Children is a better word. So the third hadith, what is the third hadith?
عن أبي عبد الرحمن عبد الله بن عمر بن الخطاب رضي الله عنهما قال سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول بني الإسلام على خمس شهادة أن لا إله إلا الله وأن محمدا رسول الله وإقام الصلاة وإيتاء الزكاة وحج البيت وصوم رمضان رواه البخاري والمسلم. On the authority of Abdullah, the son of Umar bin Khattab, who said,
It's better to say Imam an-Nawawi said. Right? Why? Because here when you read on the authority, it's like it's going back directly to you. That's just a fine point in the reading of hadith. Just like when we read the hadith in Arabic, usually say qala, right? He said, or sometimes you say bi isnadi muttasili lan nabi, by my chain of transmission that connects me all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He said, because people came before us and they heard the hadith. Right? That's from the adab of the muhaddithin. Sometimes people don't know that, period, because they just read the book knowledge. But the book knowledge with the knowledge of the mashaykh, that's where there's other issues that come into play. Right? The mashaykh, they teach us, they have their own. There's another knowledge that comes alongside the book knowledge. Like that, they teach us that when we read hadith, like instead of saying on the authority of Abdullah ibn Umar, we say that, that he said on the authority of Ibn Umar.
so Imam Nawawi said on the authority of Abdullah ibn the son of Umar bin Khattab.
And then we say Imam an-Nawawi rahimahullah, he said, right here. Because we love the ulama, those who came before you, right? I'm being hard on you today. No, I'm not being hard on you. It's part of the whole issue of the adab of the muhaddithin. And the adab of the ulama. In Azhar al-Sharif, with all of the ulama, even outside of the Masjid al-Azhar, that's always the habit of the ulama. Actually, they begin with that. They begin with a dua on the shaykh, or for the shaykh, and then they ask that we benefit from his knowledge in this world and the hereafter, that he benefits from his knowledge or her knowledge in the hereafter, because knowledge is one of those things which benefits us after death. Right? Just like sadaqah and just like dua. Right? The dua of a pious child benefits us, or sadaqah jariyah. And the same thing, so we're making dua. So Imam an-Nawawi rahimahullah, he left us knowledge along with Ibn Salah and all the other ulama rahimahullah, like Bukhari and Muslim and Tirmidhi and Ibn Majah and Abu Dawud, everybody who we relate from here. And even those who we mentioned, like Ibn Rajab and Ibn Daqiq al-Eid and Ibn Hajar rahmatullahi alayhim jamia. So that puts us like in a spiritual relationship with all of them, but it's not exaggerated. In Christianity and Catholicism, we have that, or we had that when I was a Catholic. And so it's like people like this, they consider them like saints, like the awliya. But the difference in Islam is we pray for them, right? Some people ask them for dua, but that's not my practice in specific. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala directly. But so here, that's something to consider when we talk about the adab. As far as the issue of tawassul is concerned, the issue of you ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala and you ask Allah and you say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you know, by the standing that Ahmed has with you, mentioning the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You know, please accept me or forgive me or do this for me. There's a big difference of opinion amongst the scholars of that. Mostly in the later day period. Mostly the ulama of Saudi, because some of them have went to the point of Xing that out. Even some of them have went to the extreme of saying is shirk. It's only shirk if you ask the Prophet ﷺ directly, right? And you believe that the Prophet or anybody that came, that's in the grave, that person has the power to make something happen for you from the unseen. And pretty much nobody disagrees with that. So then some of the ulama, they say, okay, fine. If you ask Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, if you make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you mention the Prophet's name from the angle of Allah with, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, I beg you, accept with the standing of your Prophet, because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is known to have been forgiven all his sins, alayhi salatu wasalam, accepted by Allah, and has the power of intercession. So a good portion of the ulama have no issue with that. If you mention, but on those terms, specifying that the Prophet ﷺ is a servant, is submitted to Allah, a creature of Allah, but that creature of Allah has special standing. With that, understand. Some of them say there's no issue with that. Imam al-Shawkani is one of them. And Imam al-Shawkani was Salafi in Aqidah, or Athari, or from the scholars of Hadith. Ibn Taymiyyah rahmatullahi alayh, he doesn't agree with that. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab doesn't agree with that. The ulama of Saudi don't agree with that, and they warn against that. And then after that, if it comes like, for instance, like a scholar that was well known, or a person that was a person of ibadah, that's where they differ. So Izzuddin Abdul Salam and Shawkani and others, even though they permit mentioning the name of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in the dua, according to what I said, that we're understanding that the Prophet is a human being, alayhi salatu wasalam, but the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not like any other human being, right? The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam has intercession power with Allah. Having that understanding, they say, okay, we agree on this point, but then they differ on, is that possible for other people? A lot of the Sufis agree with that. I personally stay away from that type of practice. One, because that has divided the Muslims extremely. But that's not to say that some of the ulama don't have the evidence of why they accept that. They accept it. But if that's a practice that people do, they should restrict it to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But with those conditions that we're not thinking that the Prophet has independent power. Right? And then that's like kind of the middle ground between us and the rest of the ummah. I personally don't practice that. Right? We have certainty that the Prophet has standing with Allah, alayhi salatu wasalam. We have certainty that the Prophet has the right of intercession, but we don't see too many of the Sahaba doing that. During life, yes, but then the difference comes after death. Even the hadith of Abbas, in which they go to the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they ask him to plead to Allah for rain. That hadith shows the uncle of the Prophet Abbas alive. That's why the ulama, everybody's with me or no? Or we're confused on that point. Confusion or no confusion? Huh? So these are one of those controversial points in Aqidah. That in today's time mostly. Right. So there's another form of tawassul. The other form of tawassul is basically coming close to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. If I ask you, if I say, Akhi al-Kareem, please pray for me, nobody disagrees with that. It's the issue of when the person is dead. That's what they disagree on. If I make a vow to Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, I vow to fast for 40 days, alleviate my situation. Nobody disagrees with that. If I give sadaqah, nobody disagrees with that. Even if I give sadaqah, on behalf of my father or my mother that passed away, or make dua for them. right? All of that is legit. The issue of reading the Quran for the person that's dead, that's where the khilaf comes. That's part of the Indo-Pak culture, right? That's where the debate comes in at. But the action, no doubt, there's no debate about that. Sadaqah on the person, building hospitals for the people, right? In the people's names. He loves the hospital situation. He works in that. Right? Donating to gain peace, all of that type of thing. That's where, and see, the Muslims used to do that in the past. Right? The Muslims used to do that in the past. They used to have an endowment to feed the cats on the streets. They used to have an endowment for the orphans, an endowment that people wanted to go to Karachi and study, like that type of thing. They used to have endowments for everything. And this system studied that, the endowment system. So we have the endowment for the humanities, the endowment for the arts, the endowments for engineering. So the people in the past, they were very giving, right? Because they had that understanding that if I give in somebody's name, right, for their benefit, then it benefits them. Go ahead, Arif.
So Imam Nawawi rahimahullah said on the authority of Abdullah, the son of Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhuma, who said, I heard the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam say, Islam has been built on 5 pillars, testifying that there is no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, establishing the salah, paying the zakah, making the hajj to the house of Allah, and fasting in the month of Ramadan. And this was narrated Bukhari and Muslim.
Right, that hadith just reaffirms what was said in the hadith of Jibreel already about Islam. But this is the basis of mostly all the introductory books of fiqh. Mostly all the introductory books of fiqh are explaining this hadith. They give you a few words on aqidah, then they talk about salah, right? Then they talk about zakat or fasting, and they talk about hajj, right? So that's the basis. And this hadith, is the pillar for what? For showing us the actions that are constant in Islam. And we mentioned already, Hafidh ibn Hajar said that jihad is not mentioned because jihad is a collective obligation. It's not an individual obligation except in certain cases. And it's not a constant in the deen. And we mentioned that yesterday. But Islam takes precaution against war because it's so destructive, the destruction of life. We mentioned one of the objectives of the deen is the preservation of life. War is what it is. But sometimes in life, war becomes necessary. There's no nation that exists without war. But jihad also doesn't mean, it doesn't equate to war in every circumstance. Because the word jihad and the word qatal are 2 different words. So jihad as a concept is part of the deen, striving for the deen. It could be striving against yourself, or it can be working hard and striving to organize the people to build the hospital. You know what I'm saying? That's it. When you take that concept of struggle and striving out of people's lives, that life doesn't have any struggle or whatever, it changes the people completely. Our youth have that problem. They think everything's supposed to come to them like a microwave dish. You've cooked the food in 2 minutes and it's presented to you with no work. And compare that to the aunties who have to prepare biryani or any other meal that takes like a whole day or 2 days of preparation or whatever. That's a completely different concept of life. So they mentioned that we shouldn't shy away from using the word jihad, but we should explain what the word jihad means so the people are not confused. And today's time, they want to take the word jihad out of the understanding of the Muslims. And that's what it leads to big mistakes. Jihad and qatl or war are not always equivalent. Majority of the time that the word jihad is used is not referring to qatl or war, but sometimes it's mentioned. The way Hafidh ibn Hajar mentioned it here, he mentioned it as war. And he says it's not from the pillars of Islam because it's a collective action. Everything that's mentioned here in the pillars is what? An individual obligation. Right? An individual obligation. But there's no doubt that he had the shay'un azim. Because you start talking about war, you start talking about the taking of life. And that's not permissible in Islam except under strict conditions. And it's not for everybody to claim that. And so some of the groups, mutatarrifin, extremist groups, they like to call on jihad for everything. and they mean war by it. And that's where, we have to be careful. Yeah, we find that it's in Islamic teachings, but it has conditions, it has responsibility that comes with it, and it's not for everybody. You have to have leadership in place, and it has to be governed by ethics. Not like the ISIS thing, you come and you chopping heads and raping women and all of that. Has to be talked about, because that's something that's distorted in the media about what Islam is. And from some people, sometimes we don't even know if they're Muslim or not. And that's the reality. So let's continue on with the fourth hadith.
حدثنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم هو الصادق المصدوق إن أحدكم يجمع خلقه في بطن أمه 40 يوما نطفة ثم يكون علقة مثل ذلك ثم يكون مضغة مثل ذلك ثم يرسل إليه الملك فينفخ فيه الروح ويؤمر ب4 كلمات بكتب رزقه وأجله وعمله وشقي أو سعيد فوالله الذي لا إله غيره إن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل الجنة حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق إليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل النار فيدخلها وإن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل النار حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل الجنة فيدخلها. رواه البخاري ومسلم. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah said on the authority of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu anhu, who said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he is the truthful, the believed, narrated to us, verily the creation of each one of you is brought together in the mother's womb for 40 days in the form of a drop. Then he becomes an alaqa, a clot of blood for a like period. Then a mudgha, a morsel of flesh for a like period. Then there is sent to him the angel who blows his soul into him, and is commanded with 4 matters: to write down his sustenance, his lifespan, his actions, whether he will be happy or unhappy. By the one other than whom there is no deity, verily one of you performs the action of the people of paradise until there is an arm's length between you and it. That which has been written overtakes him, and so he acts with the actions of the people of the hellfire, and thus enters it. And verily one of you performs the actions of the people of the hellfire until there is an arm's length between him and it, and there has been written overtakes him, and so he acts with the actions of the people of paradise, and thus enters it.
This hadith, subhanallah, it has a lot to it. We can't go into every detail, but want to have homework for you guys. And everybody write this down. One of the things that comes up is like, okay, what is the ruling of abortion in Islam? That's the first thing. What is the ruling of abortion in Islam? The second thing that comes to the fore is, when is the ruh blown into the body, so to speak, or created in the body? And so this hadith also, it gives is mushkil from the angle of, it seems problematic. Why? Because it seems like it negates the role of free will, period. Your destiny is written for you. That's it. So if your destiny is written for you already and that's it, the question becomes, why even act? why follow the deen if it's already written for me? Right? And we talked about that issue, the issue of qadr. We talked about that already. So I just want to read this point here that is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-Kahf. But as for those who have iman and do right actions, we will not let the wage, or we will not let the reward of those who do good go to waste. So that counters the whole idea of you do good is not counted. It's ayat 30 of Surah Al-Kahf. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah, he says, his saying then the decree will overtake him. That's part of the hadith. That is that the decree which preceded in knowledge, or that which preceded in the Lawh al-Mahfuz, or the preserved tablet, or that which preceded in the belly of the mother. And we have already seen that there are 4 decrees. Right. We're not going to get into that part. We'll come back to the hadith after everybody does their homework. He's saying, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until there is a cubit, only a cubit between him and it, is a metaphor by which is meant a piece of time and at the end of his life. It does not literally mean a cubit in that precise amount of time. For when the disbeliever says there is no God but Allah and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, then dies, he enters Jannah. That in itself has some issues to discuss. We can't get into all of those issues, but that's for your, tanbih, to alert you. Why? Because you're saying that the only what's sufficient to get into Jannah is just to say La ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah, believe in it, and that's it. Action is not required or anything. The issue of tawbah comes up to the fore too. But yes, the shahada is sufficient for anyone to get into Jannah. But they're under the Mashiach of Allah as well. They're under the will of Allah. If Allah wishes to take them to account for something, Allah will take them to account. But the general understanding is that they're forgiven of all of their sins. Right, with that. But it's not a game from the angle of you wait to the last moment of your life. And then you're like, I want the free entry into Jannah card. Oh, Shadu la ilaha illallah wa Muhammad Rasulullah. And that's it. That's not what's is not being indicated here. The general belief of the Muslim community is that action is, complementary to Iman. That the basics of Iman, nobody disagrees amongst the scholars that, we should act on the deen. And that there's punishment for leaving out action. But here we're talking about the disbeliever person coming into Islam. Right? That if they were to say La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah and then they die, that they enter into Jannah. When the believer says at the end of his life the word of disbelief, he enters the fire. Imam al-Nawawi rahimahullah is trying to reconcile with the hadith. Right. Read the hadith again, Arif.
The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he is the truthful, the belief narrated to us. Verily the creation of each one of you is brought together in his mother's womb for 40 days in the form of a nutfah, and then he becomes an alaqa for a like period, then a mudgha for a like period. Then there is sent to him the angel who blows his soul into him and who is commanded with 4 matters: to write down his sustenance, his lifespan, his actions, and whether he'll be happy or unhappy, whether or not he'll enter paradise. By the one other than whom there is no soul, no deity, verily one of you who performs the actions of the people of paradise until there's but an arm length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him. So he acts with the actions of the people of hellfire and enters it.
Right.
And verily one of you performs the actions of the people of hellfire written overtakes him, so he acts with the actions of people of paradise, and then he enters it.
Right. So those are the 4 decrees that were mentioned. The issue of the rizq, the issue of the lifespan, the issue of our actions, right, and whether we will be happy or unhappy. But we know that dua changes qadr. And we know that action has an impact on our iman. Either if we act of those actions which are pleasing to Allah, it raises our iman. And we mentioned that before in other places. Maybe some of you were there. That's why in Ramadan we have like an iman high. Because we're just doing good. You know what I'm saying? We're doing good of those things which are fundamental. Just the basics like salah, right? Fasting, right? We're doing, and so that elevates the iman. Is an antidote automatically. But then some people do more. Some people give, right? Some people do more. They take from their sleep, right? They're just exerting themselves. They're, into the Quran. It's just like a complete injection of iman, and that's why it transforms us. But then, there's also the issue of what? If we do bad deeds, it has an impact. If you do bad deeds in Hajj, it's not like doing bad deeds in Chicago. If you do bad deeds in the Haram, it's not like doing bad deeds in Oak Brook Terrace. That environment is a different type of environment, right? So there's certain times when bad deeds are done, it is problematic. Like in Ramadan. You do bad deeds in Ramadan, it's problematic. Just like you do good deeds in Ramadan, what happens with the reward? It increases. But here Imam an-Nawawi, he says, in the Hadith, there's proof that one must not make, right, clear statements about anyone entering the garden or the fire. You don't know. We have people that talk like that. A couple of days ago, a brother pretty much sent me to the hellfire based on something that he didn't understand that I said. We have people that talk like that. He send people to the hellfire all the time. That's the danger. Even when we deal with people and we're like, kafir, this, that, and we don't even know if the person is a believer or not. We don't know if the person is a believer. We're judging from what we see. We don't even pray for the hidayah of the people. That's problematic. And then we have the habit of the Muslims, some of them at least, they have the bad, dirty, nasty habit. When they disagree with someone or they hear something that they don't understand, they automatically call the person a kafir. That's extremely problematic. Calling a person a kafir, you're putting them in the hellfire. You're taking away their rights and their dignity. You're basically, if that person is a male or female, there's automatic divorce, no inheritance. There's a death sentence in that regard in the Muslim community. They have no life with us. And so that habit is a bad habit of those who don't know how to restrain their tongues. So here Imam an-Nawawi is saying, be careful. We can't make absolute statements about people. Of course, if there's a judge system, if a person does something which deviates from Islam and they're brought to that process in, like for instance, in the context of a Muslim government, then that's a different issue. That's a different issue. Like say for instance, if a person committed zina and with proof or whatever, or other issues that we don't have to get into from that nature, criminal nature even. There some things, then that political force has the ability to take that person to account at a level of punishment. Other than that, we only have da'wah and encouragement of the people, but the judgment is not on our part. Without a political system, you can't come into the issue of judgment like from the angle of what? In a judiciary way. We can come into a judgment like that's a bad action, right? Or that action is problematic. But what's left to us is al-mawidat al-hasana, encouraging the person by the best of means, right? But Imam an-Nawawi is saying be careful with that. Even if the person does all sorts of right action or all sorts of wrong action, and that one must not depend on one's actions nor be conceited about it. since one does not know what is the seal of one's destiny. The Sahaba always had that. They had is what he said clear or no? You know, the Sahaba, they always had that anxiety. They had an anxiety that they may have done the right thing, but it's not acceptable to Allah. That's where the hadith of intention comes in. We can pray the salah in all its proper forms, get an awesome wudu, have the awesome, smell great. You know what I'm saying? Every position is, mashallah, mechanically correct and perfect. But then in our hearts, what? Yeah, it's like, tell the other brother, mashallah, brother, in salah you were moving. Oh, brother, in salah I was moving. So in salah you were paying attention to me, brother. You know, it's like, weren't you supposed to be focusing on Allah? You're focusing on me. So the point being is that al-qabul is different than al-siha. You know, the acceptability from Allah, that Allah accepts the action, that the action is maqbool, is different than the action is sahih. If the action is sahih, it means it's sound according to the conditions we judge. But that's the danger of the heart. So the Sahaba, the danger of the heart is that it's not there with Allah. Is we're just external practices. That, you know, that's the issue. Well, nifaq al-amal. You know, that is like hypocrisy of action, not hypocrisy of belief. Hypocrisy of belief is when we don't actually believe what's in the heart. We claim that we believe in Islam, but in the heart we actually don't. But for the people, we pretend that we're Muslim. We can have characteristics of the hypocrites, right? We may have issues in our salah or other issues, but that's not the hypocrisy which takes us outside of deen. But the imperfection of our actions, that's why we talked about ihsan yesterday. That's why it's so important for us to encourage each other, and that is hard in the dunya. The dunya is a test in that regard. To have congruity, that our actions and what's going on in our heart matches. But we can do the routine action, but it may not be acceptable to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. So we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala for acceptance. But Imam al-Nawawi is saying this, right? That we have to be careful of how we're judging on this level. The Sahaba, they understood that. That's why they always felt that no matter what they did, that the action was not accepted. They were not satisfied. What was it that Aisha radiallahu anha, our mother, what did she say about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam? With regard to him praying all the time at night. No, not the Quran in action. You know?
She asked, like, why would you pray all night even if you
Yeah.
the Prophet said, like, I mean, the fact that Allah forgives you, thank you, Allah.
Yeah, ala akun abdan shakura. So that, you know, shall I not be, you know, that slave or servant of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala who's grateful. Yeah, we're pausing a little bit. We have to kind of move forward, but that's a deep statement. Because that comes back to the quality and the condition of the heart of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is not about just reward and punishment. It's reward and punishment, yes, that's there, but that has been taken away. So for instance, if Allah gave us a green card of, you know, you're good, you get into Jannah, just flow through life. Does the ibadah stop? Does the working for the deen stop? Does it stop? Okay, I gave you the get into Jannah card. You're good. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he showed us that no, that's not the reality. There's another level of the heart. There's another level in which, you know, that the relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala is a higher degree. There's stages in that. Stages. Everybody's not at the same stage in the hereafter. And that's the danger, is that like a person can give 50 cents in sadaqah and another person can give 1,000,000, and that person that gives 50 cents in sadaqah with a deep relationship with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala has a better standing than the one that gives the 1,000,000 and his action is mixed with I want to tell the mashallah, you know, mashallah, I'm giving $1,000,000. You know, that doesn't mean too, some people get it confused when sometimes in doing fundraisers, some of the brothers get, I'll give $1,000 or whatever. No, sometimes that's encouragement. We have a confusion about it. It's not necessarily riyat. It's not necessarily the hidden shirk or the showing off or whatever. That's between the person and Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala at that point. Sometimes, especially for the young people, I had a brother that would do a lot of fundraisers. He would say, I take my son and I give my son $100, whatever. Tell him, son, you go and you give it in the sadaqah. Take it and do it in the public sphere to teach the child how to give sadaqah and how to give for Allah in the community, right? Have that from that angle. So that's a quality of the heart. So the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they had that anxiety. But the Quran tells us that there's no good deed that goes without reward. That's the hope. So we, with the issue of qadr, if it's not understood properly, it's complete despair. Complete despair. Imam An-Nawawi rahimahullah, he says, for instance, in relation to the translation of the ayah, but as for those who have iman and do right actions, we will not let the wage, we basically, your reward is going to be paid for doing that good. We won't let that go to waste. Even for the non-Muslim gets rewarded for good wear. Yeah? In this life. In this life. Then the apparent meaning of the ayah is that right action from a sincere person is accepted. We talked about the issue of acceptance. And that if acceptance has been obtained because of the promise of Allah, or the generous one, the Kareem, then he is safe by that from an evil conclusion. You see that? That's how we get out of the problem of qadr. Because the hadith is like, if a person, their destiny is already written for them. You're like, oh my God, my destiny, how can I work with that? If the destiny of a person to go to hell is already written, or the destiny of a person to go to Jannah or heaven is already written, that at face value is like, why should I even, function in life? Then the encouragement comes. That's in the knowledge of Allah. But we said that the human being is unique. The human being is unique in the world. That means that the human being has responsibility. That's why the Rusul come. So sometimes when we read a hadith and stuff like that, we have to read it in the bigger context. There's no way that this hadith can cancel out the obligation to act, the responsibility that we have in the dunya, or else everything is in chaos, right? Why should we punish people? We just blame that on Allah. Na'udhu billah, right? That person goes and he kills 100 people, just blame it on Allah. That's a bad belief. That's not a correct belief. So here it's just saying, it's showing that the knowledge of Allah is absolute. But as far as the human level, how that works, we don't know. There's a lot of things that we don't know. A lot of things that we don't know. This is the issue with the people of doubt. They come in, they bring in that, well, in your, what sense does this make? Well, there's a lot of things that you don't know. You understand what I'm saying? The issue of, for instance, in the hadith itself, there was relative unseen knowledge. What's the relative unseen knowledge? Prior to 100 years, if you were to tell somebody, I can see the baby on YouTube develop, right? It was like, what? YouTube? YouTube, because you can project the image from here all the way to Pakistan, all the way to outer space and back to China, coming right back to Chicago. Everybody can see. So like, people, are you crazy? You're talking about, how is that even possible? Imagine 100 years before. You take the ultrasound, you can see the child in development, right? That's not knowledge of the unseen in the absolute sense. But we didn't know that before. That's knowledge of the unseen in a relative sense. There's some things in the dunya, as far as the unseen, that is a matter of just not having the knowledge scientifically, so to speak, that it could be understood, rational. And then there's some things from the unseen that's impossible for us to know. Like, do we know absolutely how the angels look that are with us? That's just from the complete unseen. Do you know what country you're going to die in? How you're going to die? Can you discover that? Can that be discovered ever? You know, there's some things that is just like absolute unseen. Can you describe the Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala only from your intellect? You know, or do you need revelation in order to get to that point? You know, so there's some knowledge that's absolute and some knowledge that's what? Relative with regard to the unseen. As far as absolute unseen that we can never know by ourselves with intellect, with experience, or you know, that's the knowledge that revelation teaches us. So I think we hit a lot on the hadith. We have to move forward. And there's more to that. We said there was homework. What's the homework? What's the ruling on abortion in Islam? Why? Because this hadith talks about the development of life within the womb of the mother. And what else? Yeah, when is the ruh blown in? That's going to tie into the issue of abortion. Are there we can add on to that? Are there exceptions for abortion in Islam? Is our understanding of abortion the same as the Catholics and others? You don't have to go into that depth, but you know, that's something to be seen. And for the sisters, not for the brothers, for the sisters that have been raped, like in Syria or whatever, are they obligated to have those children? We're dealing with that. We can't hide from it. We're dealing with that. And if a sister comes and she says, I had an abortion, I feel bad about it, how do you counsel that sister? You know, so that's the issue that comes into play. So that's for homework. Okay, let's go.
Imam Nawawi rahimahullah said, on the authority of the mother of the faithful, Aisha radiallahu anha, who said, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, he who innovates something in this matter of ours that is not of it will have it rejected by Allah. This is related by Bukhari and Muslim, and in the version of Muslim it reads, he who does not act which we have not commanded will have it rejected by Allah.
There's a lot to be said about this hadith. We can't go into all of the details. Other than to say that one is important in this age to come to know who Aisha is. That's one thing that's very important. Especially when we start talking about the development of women and the role of women and so on and so forth. But Hafidh ibn Rajab, he says that this hadith is foundational. It's a hadith around which knowledge of the deen revolves. It's the scale for action. The hadith of intention is the scale for what? Yeah, the acceptance. What else? The life of the heart. Acceptance in the life of the heart. This hadith goes together with that hadith. The hadith of intention is talking to us about, you know, what's going on in the heart. You know, and why are we doing something? The hadith of bid'ah is telling us what? That our actions have to be in conformity. In other words, if we're talking about ibadah, we're talking about worship. In Islam, do we make up our own forms of worship? Yes or no? Why? Why can't I be creative, dude? My life. I'm waiting for an answer. There's a concept that the scholars have, al-ibadah, yani al-ibadah tawqifiyya. And basically what that means is that ibadah, worship, is something which comes from the messenger that we have to be taught. It's something that comes from revelation. It's something that has to be legislated. So it's not an issue of personal opinion, not an issue of ijtihad. It has to have a basis. It has to have a foundation in the deen. And so here, the issue of ibadah, all ibadah, there's a rule, all ibadah, it needs intention. All ibadah needs intention. So then, not only does it need intention, all ibadah has to conform, like Imam Abi Zayd says, conform with the sunnah. Part of that. He says that Iman is confessing that Allah is one, that the messenger, that Rasulullah sallallahu, that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and that we believe that with our hearts and that we act upon it, right? And all our action has to have an intention, and all our action and intention has to be for Allah, has to be grounded in the sunnah. In other words, the concept is that ibadah is something that we don't just make up. How to get to Allah, we didn't know that. Human beings the messenger had to come and teach us how to make our way to Allah. Prior to the messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, humanity was at a loss. That's the reason for the Rusul. The Rusul come to remind us on who we are, who Allah is, how to get to Allah, right? And so bid'ah, right, and it's a scale for external actions, as the hadith of intention is the scale for internal actions. And Imam Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, he said this hadith is clear in rejecting any sort of addition that people bring to the deen or any invention. And then he says it's evidence that contracts which are not according to Islam are void. It's good that he mentioned that, because the economic side is something that we don't talk about. Right? And so we stop for the salah.
Inshallah, salah will be in a couple of minutes. Just wanted to remind you all that alhamdulillah, this class is free of charge. But we hope that
So we'll come back after salah.
We hope that inshallah you still provide some level of support, inshallah. The booklets are a gift, inshallah. We have another gift for you, a bookmark, inshallah. So please pass it around. You can utilize this for the book as well. And then inshallah, after the salah, please try to come back as soon as possible so we can restart our class.
I'm thinking to myself, we could, I was calculating that. Even if we did 13 hadith, we're at the 6 hadith now. So we get to 13, we fall one short. One hadith short. As far as the days.
You have 2 more days.